You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have Tom Sawyer, the COO of Cognetivity, Cognetivity, Cognetivity.com. So Tom, thanks for coming. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on, Richard.
Yeah. So tell me about Cognetivity. Sounds like it has to do something with thinking. So what's the premise of the company?
Absolutely. So, we spun out from research in Cambridge University in the UK. But really what we're about is answering a massive problem there is in the healthcare business at the moment, in that the diagnosis of dementia is so problematic and so poorly done around the world that 1 in 2 people never receive a diagnosis, and those that do tend to receive it too late to be able to be helped by existing treatments. Okay, so the answer to this really is to do with being able to detect much better, much earlier. So what we had developed is a platform which allows the detection in small changes in cognitive functions, so your ability to process information, that can be easily scaled and distributed, and it solves this problem in that it's able to capture the kinds of early cognitive signs, decline signs that are associated with dementia.
So what's the current state? How is dementia first observed and then confirmed by diagnosis, and how would you do it differently?
Sure. So what currently happens at the moment is a bit of a mess if we're looking at it as a global situation, in that there are lots of different ways of doing it. But generally speaking, what happens at primary healthcare, so this is when you go to your family physician, is that they will be listening out for signs that you've got some sort of memory problem, generally speaking, and it's often reported by a relative. So if your wife or carer or somebody says, I think I'm worried about them, they're not really performing very well, they're very forgetful, that tends to be the first flag, okay, that something might be wrong. Now, the physicians then, generally speaking, have some fairly kind of short and crude pen and paper tests, which just ask you, a few questions, some basic memory stuff. And then on the back of that, the physician says, okay, well, maybe I'll refer you to see a specialist for this. Now, the problem with this at the moment is that it's rather ad hoc, so it's only really when it comes to the attention of the physician that they will even do something about it. But also, the main problem is that the time at which that kind of diagnosis happens tends to be really late in the process, if it happens at all. So these tests that they're using are really not very sensitive, kind of crude, and they have a number of problems, which I'll go into a little more in a moment. But they rely also on self-reporting as well. So what you need to do is to get sort of a grip on this, that there's some issue happening way before it presents itself as memory problems. Okay, so you really need to be able to see it, a good 10, 15 years earlier before people show heavy impairment.
Well, how are you supposed to do that if the symptoms are barely there, or if the person thinks, I'm fine? Until it becomes a problem, most people don't take action. Everyone's like that. So what do you do?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. So the trick then really is to expose people to some sort of testing, which is able to pick up on these earlier stage loss of capability, particularly in cognition. So the way that we do it is that a test that you can take very, very simply, which shows these early stages of cognition, it can be used much like a blood pressure test, for example. So the idea with a blood pressure test is that you are able to get some clinically meaningful information about a patient before it develops into a big problem. So if you're showing a slightly elevated blood pressure, it doesn't mean you're going to drop dead from a heart attack. It means that your physician is able to say, okay, well, what's the problem here? Can we explain it? If we can't explain it, we'll refer you to a cardiovascular specialist in plenty of time for them to be able to help you. So likewise for cognitive function, if you're able to pick up on the first stages of cognitive impairment, so if someone's not quite where you'd expect them to be in terms of their cognitive function, you can then say, okay, well, can we explain this in terms of are they on medication, are they alcohol impaired, are they suffering from depression, or a number of other factors which may explain it. If it can't be explained by the physician, then they will then refer you to a memory clinic or a specialist in cognitive function, really nice and early so that they can get plenty of time to work out what it is and then devise a treatment plan which will really slow down the decline.
Well, so what are some examples of the various types of dementia? What are treatment plans? If it's caught, I don't know, 3 or 4 years earlier than it normally would be caught, will that do anything? Or will that just, make the person feel doomed for longer?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good question. So now, the situation in diseases like Alzheimer's, and we use Alzheimer's as an example here, there are no disease-modifying drugs available for Alzheimer's yet, and the pharma industry is throwing billions of dollars at this because they really know that if somebody gets in there, it's a massive growing market and all these things are unmet need. But despite that, there are a number of things that specialists can do to help basically slow down the rate of decline. So there are things to do with diet, behavioral changes. There are some drugs which treat the symptoms, which are effective at certain times in the disease. So these things combined can effectively slow the rate of decline, which basically extends the useful or functional life of the individual. So what tends to happen at the moment is someone gets a late diagnosis, so they're like moderate to severe Alzheimer's. It causes a massive problem in terms of the administration of their estate. It's a bombshell for the family. And they tend to end up in residential care quite quickly. And that is the really expensive part of healthcare provision, is this residential care. If you detect it much earlier, you can offset that requirement for residential care by a significant amount of time. And this has really, really big financial implications for payer systems, right? So whether it's in the UK, it's like the NHS, or in the US, it's insurance payer systems and so on. This is the expensive part. So even if you can just delay that by a few years, that massively helps in terms of the cost. And in fact, the Alzheimer's Association last year produced a report which looked into the health economic benefits of early detection. And what they calculated was that if all the current people in the US who have dementia were diagnosed early, the potential savings for the payer system over the lifetime of all these patients is $7.9 trillion. So there's a massive economic imperative to do this.
Again, what would happen if you diagnosed early? You talk about residential care. That's what, a nurse coming into the home to care for the person so they don't have to, live in a nursing home? Or how would this...
Sure, yeah.
I mean, maybe some specifics. How would this save money and why?
Yeah. So if you delay the entry to these residential care homes, that saves an awful lot of money. So what is actually done are behavioral changes, lifestyle changes, mental exercise, and a certain amount of drugs will allow this to happen much later, this requirement for residential care. So, like I say, basically, you increase the useful or the functional lifespan of the person. So this final decline into where people can't really look after themselves is much, much delayed.
I got you. Okay, that makes sense. So how would cognitivity work? If someone suspects that they may have a problem, what are the steps they go through with cognitivity?
Sure. So what we developed is this cognitive testing platform, which has a very simple premise at the heart of it. So basically, you are shown very short duration images, and you have to say something about the content of these images. Okay. Now, these are, in terms of experimental work which we've published to date, are actually pretty good at picking up on what we call mild cognitive impairment. So this is the pre-symptomatic dementia phase. Now, MCI, as we call it, is really the kind of holy grail in terms of both treatment and clinical trials, and also, in terms of detection. So you're picking up on people before they are demonstrating full-blown symptoms. Okay. Now this happens 10 to 15 years before you're really showing, coming up and being diagnosed as a full-on Alzheimer's patient. So what's required then is that you take the test earlier. So what happens with our platform is that you are able to do this visual test on an iPad or on your phone. Actually, we have it developed for too, but primary clinical application is on an iPad. So the ideal situation would be that if you are, let's say, over 55 years in age, whenever you go to see your physician, you would be able to take this test, in the same way that you would have a blood pressure test or a cholesterol test. The results would then be reported to your physician so that when they examine you, you go to your consultation, they're able to say, okay, well, you're in the normal range for cognitive function for someone of your age, okay? And if you aren't, then let's look into it. So what we would propose is that people are able to do this test on a regular basis, if they're in an at-risk group, which is primarily an age factor, but there are other factors that you would take into.
All right, so this test will evaluate the fact that they may have an issue or that they do have an issue. How detailed does the test get, and does it distinguish between flavors of potential problems, different types of dementia?
Sure. So, the first application is really, like I say, like the blood pressure test, in that it is not specific. So we're not saying that you would do the test and then this, a light would flash and it would report you as being an Alzheimer's patient. It would say that your brain is not processing information in the way that we might expect. Now, there could be a myriad of reasons for that, such as, like I said, drug or alcohol impaired, you've been suffering from lack of sleep, you could be depressed, there could be other reasons for it. So that allows the doctor then to make a clinical decision based on this in the context of everything else. So your cognitive function is not where it should be. Let's look into why. I can't explain it. Then I would send you to be referred to a specialist to work out really why. So, this is kind of why what we offer fits in pretty well into the healthcare system, because it doesn't require change in what people do. It just allows them to be much more effective at doing it. Okay, so we basically replace this kind of ad hoc and insensitive way of detecting people with our platform, which is able to pick it up much, much earlier and with much greater degree of confidence that there is an issue. Okay, so that's stage one. Now, where this goes ultimately is really in the data side. So we use AI in order to improve the training of our platform. So as we grow our data sets, i.e., we are able to measure the pattern of responses of people who we know what category they're in, so whether they're MCI patients, mild Alzheimer's patients, and so on, look at the pattern of their responses and then use our AI technology to say, okay, well, they could look like they're likely to be like this, which would then help the clinicians to make a diagnosis. Now, we can then train this platform with more and more data and also for different conditions. So not only would we expect that an Alzheimer's patient would be able to be, we would have a rough idea that this is maybe what the problem is, we can use it for other things. So we've done a study into MS already. There are a number of other diseases or conditions that we might be able to do this with, for example, concussion or anything else that has a measure of cognitive impairment associated with it.
This seems like a really tough thing because, it seems like you would need years and years and years of data to confirm that it actually is a signal and it can predict it. How do you go about something like that? How do you really know that it's working, and how do you fine tune it as well?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the data sets that you require in order to be able to say something about the results that you're getting from the subject, they don't have to be that big. It's really down to quality as much as anything else. So when we are looking at the characteristics of the patient population, we would do very tightly controlled studies, basically, which have them taking our test, but also then we take other measures, including a full clinical diagnosis by a specialist, but also other, sensitive cognitive tests that we're able to do. So we're able to validate against not only general cognitive state, but then also against disease conditions. So, in order to train the engines, these data sets can be the order of hundreds rather than thousands of patients if the data are of a high quality. Okay? So that's not too bad.
But, there are other ways to find early onset or early stage dementias, and that's why you're able to correlate what you're doing with those findings.
That's right. So there are some what we would call gold standard tests. So the one that we use quite often is a thing called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test. So this is an expert-administered 15-minute cognitive test, which is considered to be, all things considered, a pretty good example of what can currently be done. Now, we end up with a good relationship with that, but we don't end up with a perfect relationship with that, because if we had a perfect relationship with Mocha, then we'd be just doing what the Mocha does. Now, what we find is that when we get involved with much more involved testing, so for example, there is a test called BICAMS, which is used in multiple sclerosis, which is a 25 to minute to half an hour test, which is very good at sort of sensitive and kind of early stage impairment. And it takes a long time to administer, obviously, and it requires an expert to do it. We find that the better the test is, the better our relationship is with it. So we correlate very, very well with the BICAMS, but our test takes less than 5 minutes, and it doesn't need to be administered by an expert. So, there are many ways that you can diagnose, even through to things like imaging. So, you can use MRI scanning and so on to look at whether there's any structural damage in the brain. You can do biomarkers from spinal fluid. All these things are combined a very, very sure way of telling whether you've got, for example, Alzheimer's, so a neurodegenerative disease. And they're extremely expensive, they're very invasive, and they are not suitable for a wide population to be administered to them. So that's where you end up if we're trying to work out what's wrong with you, but we want to make sure that we're only doing those tests on people that we are pretty sure we should be doing them to. Because what happens at the moment with referrals to specialists is that they tend to see two types of people. So our chief medical officer is a specialist in geriatric psychiatry. Now, he tends to see in his clinical practice two types of people. Either people who are really quite severely impaired, and it takes him 1 minute to diagnose them. Really, he knows they've got a problem. It's very apparent. It doesn't take a massive amount of his expertise to work out what's wrong with them. Or he gets people who they've forgotten maybe they've lost their keys a few times, or they think they might have an issue. So this is a group of people we call the worried well. So they will insist on being referred to the specialist. So they'll go to see the specialist. The specialist will run the full sort of bank of tests on them and find that there's nothing wrong with them, and they shouldn't have been there in the first place. So this kind of lack of efficiency is a very big expense in the system, in that there are thousands of dollars worth of tests that need to be done in order to give someone the all clear. But if you're able to say that they are cognitively normal or functioning normally for roughly what you'd expect before they even get referred, then they don't need to be referred. You can reassure them at that point very cheaply.
What kinds of dementia or mental issues does your test seem to be good at, and which ones is it weaker at versus the gold standard?
Yeah, so our test is actually very good at detecting the early stage stuff. So what our test does is it takes a very objective measure of how quickly your brain can process complicated information in a timely and accurate fashion. Okay, so any condition that has a degree of cognitive impairment, our test will pick up on it, because it's literally reporting how quickly you can deal with information, the complicated information. So it doesn't really have any weaknesses. Its strengths are definitely in the fact that it seems to be, from the experimental work we've done, very good at picking up on these kind of early and small changes in people's cognition. And actually, that's where it needs to go. It is not hard to pick up on severe impairment. There are many ways to do that. There's no lack of efficiency at that. It's really at the other end you want to go for. So, and that seems to be what our test is particularly adept at doing. So that's good. And just another sort of point I'd like to make about that, because I've talked about how we can compare a subject's results with populations that we know about. So you can say, okay, well, for your age, you are roughly in the normal range. So that's fine, and that has a very big role to play in diagnosis. When it gets particularly interesting is if you're able to work out where somebody performs relative to themselves. So our system is very good for this, because you set a baseline, you get a sort of a section, a group of scores that you take on the test. And if you keep taking it periodically, it will tell you where you perform relative to yourself. So that's very useful in picking up on the really, really early stages, because people make this within a range of a population. But when you have your own range, which is much finer than that, much, much narrower than that, and that then allows you to do it against yourself. So that's when the thing gets really, really powerful. So if people are taking it regularly, once you've taken it a few times, these small changes become apparent, and the engine is very good at picking up on those. So that's really where the great efficiencies are in there. But that's not to say that.
Well, there's a lot of I can see there's a lot of confounding factors. I mean, does age play a role? If so, how so? Gender, economic circumstance, training, education-wise, time of day, what they ate. And then if you do repeated tests, you get better at the test. Like when people take a certain test, sometimes they tend to get better at it. They just get more used to that kind of test. So how do you eliminate all those factors to get a true reading?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So I'll deal with the getting better at the test thing first. So that's actually one of the main differences that our test has with others, compared with others, in that most tests show a learning effect. So if you were to do something like the Mocha test or any of these traditional, shall we say, pen and paper tests that are used, as you do more of them, you get better at them. Okay, so that obviously masks any underlying trends that might be there. Now, with our test, the way that the visual information is processed means that the question you're asked about the image that you saw, if you can't pull that out, you can never pull that out. So you can't learn this test. Either your brain can process it or it can't. Okay, so that means that in the experiments we've done for people doing it repeatedly, they show a very quickly reach a ceiling, and then they don't do better than that. So the test does not display any false positive scores, as it were. You can't get lucky on it. Right. So that's actually really, really important. And that goes through to the other factors that you mentioned. I mean, education is a really interesting point. So one of the biggest correlates of performance in these cognitive tests is actually education, which is really independent of your cognitive function. It just shows that you are more comfortable taking a test. You're more, used to this experience. So that the level of education always correlates very, very well with performance. And that is something, again, that is masking the true measure you're trying to look here is really how well do you process information, not how good are you at taking an exam. And there are a number of other things. Language has a big issue with this as well, in that if you're taking a test in English, but English is not your first language, you're going to score more poorly than a native English speaker. Okay, this again is a big problem. So all these combined are really reasons why the kind of current testing landscape doesn't fulfill what it needs to do, which is subjective testing. Now, our test does not use language at all. The only language you need is the instructions at the beginning, and then it's a purely visual test from there on. And we've shown that it doesn't have any cultural biases in terms of the report. So there are a number of basic design ways that we've done this, which deal with a lot of the problems of testing.
Well, what's interesting is that if your test really is robust and good, which I'm sure it is, you can test other interventions that maybe people can't test. What if someone does your test and they show mild impairment and they go crazy doing crosswords or Sudoku, or they take a class and, whatever, and they decide to really work on their head. They come back and maybe they test better. Maybe you'd see an effect like that. Or they change their diet. Maybe you see an effect like that. Maybe this is a vehicle to do clinical trials for these types of things to improve people's lot without, getting too crazy or spending millions of dollars to do so. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a very astute point. I mean, that's exactly how we see it as well. I mean, we believe that the tool will enable you to pick up on subtle changes. So if we look at some, like kind of an obvious example would be that if you go to see a specialist, they give you a course of treatment, and generally speaking, you would come back in, let's say, 6 weeks later. So this is a sort of a black hole in anybody's ability to see what's going on in this 6 weeks. If you were at home, you could take the test on a daily or twice weekly basis or something. There would be an ongoing record of how well you were responding to treatment. Okay, which means that either it's going great and you don't need to come back in, or it's going really badly. Let's bring you back in more quickly. So that's from a treatment side of things. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we are conducting studies internally that are looking into some of these subtle changes of things like sleep, exercise, things like diet, and so on, because we really believe that the tool is very appropriate for that. And there's an awful lot of very interesting information to come from studies like that.
That's great. And what about the AI component? Are you just trying to hone in the tool and make it better? Are you trying to find more nuance in the types of dementia that people tend to show, or the ways in which they fail to test?
Yeah. So I mean, that's part of an ongoing effort for us, is really to keep training this. So if we can learn to understand the patterns of responses and at levels of accuracy and speed and so on in people's response to the test, then we can match those to different groups, like I said. So that's the kind of the superficial level, or the base level for what we're doing. Just a point I'd make is it's not like you can fail the test. This test it has a range of scores. So the test is actually necessarily very difficult. So nobody can get a full mark on this test, and that's really important in order to be able to pick up on the fine subtle changes or the very early stages of any sort of impairment. But there's no such thing as failing it. But yeah, I mean, the base level for the AI is comparing you to known populations, as I discussed earlier. The next level for that is actually including other measures. So things like you could include information from wearables, collect information on sleep patterns, on your diet, and also there would be the potential to include other measures such as things in health records or other pieces of information that you could then make a much more involved model that would be better at predicting, the early signs of any problem and be able to say something about what that might potentially be.
Are there ways in which people perform poorly on the test that are varied? Are there ways that people perform well on it that are varied? I mean, I would think it doesn't just test for one thing, it tests for multiple aspects of cognition. So what kind of surprises or data or nuance have you seen in the testing and the results?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't think there are any particular surprises in the data in that because of the way that the test works on it engages a really large amount of your brain in the task. I mean, that's really at the heart of what's so good about this is that it engages the visual cortex and then has to go to the prefrontal cortex to look for patterns, then it has to engage the motor cortex. And this is very, very important because engaging large numbers of brain cells in a single task is actually the best way to find sensitive results. But yeah, I don't think there's any particular surprises in there. What we think is interesting is again looking into other things it can detect. So as an example, let's look at concussion in sports. So a lot of the vast majority of light concussions in sport are not reported, but we believe these could show up on a test like ours. And then you could chart recovery and let you know when it's safe to return to action and so on like that. So I think the surprises actually may come in more the kinds of impairment it pick up on, rather than something like, people perform more poorly than you might expect under certain circumstances. But, as our data sets grow and grow, there will be undoubtedly some very interesting stories in there.
Okay. Well, lost you right at the end, but very good. So what do you see as happening over the next 6 months or a year or maybe even 2 years? Where's the platform going? What are your hopes or goals or metrics for it?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the main things that we're working on at the moment is really our regulatory studies. So what's important or necessary when you go to have a product, a medical device or software or whatever that is to be used in a clinical environment, i.e. by doctors, you have to do clinical validation, and that's really dealing with the FDA. So we are currently going through a trial which will allow us to submit to the FDA to allow the platform to be used in clinical environments, so used by doctors. So that's an ongoing process. We would expect that would, hopefully complete around the end of the year. We're also doing something quite exciting, though, in that we signed an agreement with a company a few months ago, which is to do health monitoring for insurance customers, basically. So the idea is that if you are able to monitor your ongoing performance in terms of your health, so this is looking at obvious things like your weight and so on, but measuring your heart rate and sleeping patterns and so on. We have brought to the table this idea that you can have a cognitive module in there, which will allow people for the first time to say something meaningful about their brain health. Okay, and that's something that we're going to be going to market with pretty soon, and that's actually really exciting because there is a strong body of evidence that says that if people are in control of their own health by being able to measure it and be able to see the impacts of things they do day in day out on their health, then their behaviors improve. They tend to be more healthy. So we're really excited to be part of that, and that's going to generate a massive amount of really interesting data when we're able to relate cognitive function to these other measures and really look into large populations of people who will do the test regularly on a day in day out basis. And these are healthy people, so it's going to be really interesting. So we're very excited about that. And then just above and beyond that, we're really going to expand
one warning for that. If you want people to do it more than once, obviously it has to be gamified, but obviously there has to be a mechanism by which they can improve themselves. Otherwise, it's like weighing yourself every day, and you could be depressed about it. It's low one day, and then it goes back to normal. And why was it low? And you may worry about that. So I think there needs to be a mechanism for it to go higher, not just lower, or stay same.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and that's what it does. I mean, if we're talking about people being able to measure their own cognitive function, this would be relative to themselves, and of course, it can go both ways. There isn't any doubt about that. What it does is it allows people to see the impact of what they do. But yeah, I mean that's exactly it. And I think that the way that people engage with the platform is very important with that. And it's interesting you mentioned gamification of it. That's an element which helps to encourage people to do it. What we actually find anecdotally is that people tend to enjoy doing the task, but actually when you add a small element of competition into it, it becomes quite interesting, and that people try very hard to show their cognitive performance is good, and that actually brings the best out in terms of the data we get, because the harder people try, the better the quality of the data and the more consistent people become. So yeah, I think the gamification has a role to play in that.
Well, very good. Well, what's the best way for people to find out more?
Absolutely. Go to the website, Cognetivity.com. We're a public company, so if people are interested, they can get involved in the stock. But yeah, absolutely. The website is a great place to start. And yeah, we'd be very interested to hear from people who find us interesting.
Well, Tom, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.